this is a dissection doing the 8 cranial bones. The first cranial bone is this one right here. This is the frontal bone. Just posterior to the frontal bone, we have 2 bones that form the side wall of the cranial vault. This is known as the parietal bone. So we have a left and right parietal bone. Then when we turn the skull backwards, this whole posterior bone is the occipital bone. Now there's landmarks that we have to find on the occipital bone. So this big bump right over here is called the external occipital protuberance. A lot of times we just abbreviate it the EOP. From here, we're going to turn the skull upside down just so we can see some of the other landmarks. Here again is the EOP. Then there's a ridge of bone right here going towards this hole. This ridge of bone is known as the external occipital crest. Finally, here there's a curved bone right here and a curved bone right here. These are known as the occipital condyles. And so those are the occipital condyles. The last 2 structures, again, we're going to look at the back of the skull this way. The last 2 structures are lines. They come off of they have a relationship with the EOP. Coming off sideways right here, this ridge of bone and this ridge of bone, these are the superior nuchal lines. And then if you go down maybe about a ½ inch or so, this ridge of bone right over here and this ridge of bone right over here are the inferior nuchal lines. Right, so EOP, superior nuchal line on this side, inferior nuchal line on that side. Superior, inferior. The next bone is the temporal bone. There are 2, there's one on the right and there's one on the left. So the temporal bone, the first landmark we want to find is this arch right over here, this back part of our cheek arch. This is known as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. It goes about up to this orange line right here. Then right here where the zygomatic process begins, underneath it, there's a little bit of a depression right here. This is known as the mandibular fossa. This is going to receive this portion right here of the jawbone known as the mandible, and that would kind of go together like that. So this way we can speak this way. Okay. So zygomatic arch, this little notch right here is the mandibular fossa. Sticking down is this little point right here. This is known as the styloid process. And then just posterior to that, this big bump here, just behind your ear, this is known as the mastoid process. The last 2 cranial bones are the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone. We'll do the sphenoid bone first. We see the sphenoid best right here from this orange line all the way over to here. This is the sphenoid bone. This whole middle part is known as the body. On the top of the body, there's a depression right here. This is known as the sella turcica. This houses the pituitary gland. Then there's 2 sets of wings. This wing right here, all of this in here, just inside this orange line, this is known as the greater wing. Over here would be the other greater wing. Just above it and a little bit anterior, this ridge of bone right here, all of this and all of this, these are the lesser wings. The last bone is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is a bone, if we put it like right here and pushed it straight into the skull, we would see the top of the ethmoid bone here. This whole orange outline here and everything in the middle is known as the cribriform plate. So here's the cribriform plate, here's the cribriform plate. Then this piece of bone sticking up right here extends up from the cribriform plate. This is known as the crista galli. So here we're seeing the ethmoid bone from above. The last way we can see the ethmoid bone would be here. If you can look into the nasal cavity, there's a plate of bone that comes down from the cribriform plate. It forms the top half of the nasal septum. So just behind my stick is the perpendicular plate. That forms the upper half of the nasal septum. In a little bit, we'll do a different bone here called the vomer. That forms the lower half. The last structure, there's two scrolls, these upper scrolls here, and then there's one on the other side. These are known as the middle nasal concha. They're part of the ethmoid bone also, and they help to warm and humidify the air. The last structure on our checklist, if we put the skull cap back on, and by the way, the skull cap is known as the Calvaria. If we place that back on, this uniting place where the temporal bone meets the sphenoid bone from the outside, meets the frontal bone from anterior, and the parietal bone from above. This kind of union, this joining place right here, is known as the pterion.